Do you remember the sound a house made when everyone was home? Not the television. There was no television, just voices and music and the creak of a screen door and maybe somebody laughing in the next room over something you couldn't quite hear. That sound. Do you remember it? Because I do, and I've been thinking about it a lot lately, about what we did with ourselves before there was a screen to look at, before there was a remote to pick up, before entertainment was something that came to you. We went to it, we made it, we invented it out of thin air and a front porch, and whoever happened to show up that evening. And I want to take you back there today, not to feel sorry for what we've lost, but to remember what we actually had. Because I think what we had was something. My name is Marie, and if you've sat with me before, you know I like to take my time. Pull up a chair. This one's going to take a while. Let me start at the very beginning, before any of the games, or the music, or the storytelling. Let me start with the porch. If you grew up in almost any part of this country before, say 1955, you grew up with a porch, a real one. Not a decorative little landing with two potted plants, but a wide, covered, proper porch with a swing or a glider, or at the very least two wooden chairs that your father had painted white every spring, whether they needed it or not. That porch was not decoration. That porch was the living room. That porch was the entertainment center. That porch was where life happened from the time the sun got low until the fireflies came up. You sat out there after supper, everybody did, the whole neighborhood, every house up and down the street. People just came outside. And you waved, and they waved back, and sometimes they wandered over. And before long, there were 6 of you sitting in the dark, swatting mosquitoes and talking about nothing and everything all at once. Nobody planned it. Nobody sent an invitation. The porch was the invitation. And here's something I want you to sit with for a moment. Nobody was bored. Isn't that something? We had nothing by today's standards. No devices, no streaming, no 200 channels. We had each other and the evening air and maybe a jar of sweet tea. And nobody was bored. Not really. Because boredom, I've come to believe, is not the absence of things to do. Boredom is the absence of people to be with. And we were never without people. Now, the porch was where the grown-ups gathered. But the children, oh, the children had a whole other world going on. Do you remember the games, not board games, not video games, the street games, the yard games, the games that didn't need anything but your body? And a little open space and somebody willing to be. It hide and seek. Kick the can, Red Rover, hopscotch drawn in chalk or sometimes just scratched into the dirt with a stick. Tag in so many versions, freeze tag, TV tag, shadow tag. We kept inventing new rules because the game was never really about the rules. It was about running, about being outside until your mother called you in and then pretending you didn't hear her the first 2 times. And the time, I want to talk about the time we had. Summer days back then were long in a way that is hard to explain to someone who has only ever known a scheduled childhood. There was no camp pickup at 3, no enrichment program, no practice. There was morning, and then there was the long golden middle of the day, and then there was supper, and then there was the evening, and somehow all of it got filled. We filled it ourselves. I remember one summer, I must have been about 9 years old. My cousin Dottie came to stay for 2 weeks, and the 2 of us built an entire town in the backyard out of scrap lumber. My father had stacked by the fence an old tin cans and a piece of garden hose and some rope. We gave every building a name. We had a post office and a grocery and a house for each of our dolls. We played in that town for the better part of 10 days before a thunderstorm knocked most of it flat. And when it fell, we weren't sad. We just started planning what to build next. That was childhood then. Not consumed, but creative. Not entertained, but inventing. Now I want to talk about music, because music was the heartbeat of everything before TV, and I don't think people fully understand what that means. Today, music is something you put in your ears while you do something else. It's background. It fills silence. But before television, and I mean really before, back in the 30s and 40s and even into the early 50s, music was the event itself. Music was what you did on a Friday night. Music was the whole reason you got dressed up. Every town had dances, not the formal kind, necessarily, though there were those too, but community dances, barn dances, church hall dances, grange hall dances. Somebody brought a fiddle, somebody else brought a guitar. If you were lucky, there was an upright bass and a man who could really play it, and then the whole floor moved. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, and we had a dance at the Grange Hall on the 2nd Saturday of every month from April through October. My mother would get her hair done on Friday. She'd press my father's good shirt herself with a damp cloth over it so it wouldn't scorch. And on Saturday evening, the whole family went. And I mean the whole family, babies and grandparents, and everybody in between. Nobody hired a sitter because there was nothing to sit for. Children were brought, they danced too. Or they ran around underfoot, or they fell asleep on someone's coat in a corner. Those dances went until midnight sometimes, and the children slept right through the last hour of it. And here's what I want to tell you about those dances. You didn't have to know how to dance. That was never the point. The point was to be there, to be in the room, to feel the music move through the floorboards up into your shoes, to clap when everyone clapped. To swing someone's grandmother around the floor on a waltz and have her laugh out loud. Music at home was the same way, not passive, but participatory. Almost every family I knew had a piano, or a fiddle, or at the very least a harmonica that somebody's uncle kept in his shirt pocket, and people played them. Not perfectly, not professionally. They played them because that was how you made music. You made it yourself, or you sat next to someone who was making it and you sang along. Sunday evenings at my grandmother's house, after the supper dishes were cleared, my Aunt Vera would sit down at the upright piano in the parlor and everybody would gather around. And we'd sing hymns and then we'd sing the old songs after the ball, and Red River Valley and You Are My Sunshine. And my grandfather would harmonize in his low, slow voice. And my grandmother would wipe her eyes because she always cried when people sang together, not from sadness but from something that didn't have a name. Do you know that feeling? That feeling of voices blending together in a room? It does something to you that no recorded music quite manages. It opens something up in the chest. Now let's talk about something that ran alongside all of this storytelling, because before TV the story was alive. It lived in the mouths of the people who told it, and every family had its tellers. My grandfather on my mother's side was a storyteller. He had grown up in Kentucky, coal country, and he had stories about things that would curl your hair, about mules that fell into mine shafts, about a flood in 1917 that took 3 houses off their foundations and carried them a quarter-mile down into the creek, about a one-eyed man named Harlan who could predict rain by the way his knees ached, and who was right more often than the almanac. Those stories were history. They were living history, passed mouth to ear, specific and strange and true, and the children, we never asked him to stop. We never wandered off or checked something else. We sat on the floor by his chair and we listened, because a good storyteller earns your whole attention, and you give it gladly. And there was always a lesson in it somewhere, but it was never stated plain. It was sewn into the story so that you found it yourself later, sometimes years later, and when you did find it, you held on to it differently than anything you'd ever been told outright. That is the gift of the story told slowly by someone who lived it, in a room where everyone already knew some version of the people involved. That is something no screen has ever quite replicated. Now I want to take a little turn here and talk about reading, because before television, books were not optional. Books were not a hobby for a certain kind of person. They were just what you did when you sat still. The library was a destination. A real destination like the Five and Dime or the soda fountain. You planned your trip to the library, you took it seriously, you carried your card in your good pocket, and the librarian knew your name, and she knew what you'd read, and if she thought you were ready for something a little harder, she'd slide it across the counter without making a fuss about it, just a small nod like she was letting you in on a secret. I must have been 11 the first time our librarian, Mrs. Aldrich, a tall woman with silver hair and very small glasses, I must have been 11 when she handed me a book without my asking. Little Women, and she said simply, "I think you'll like this one, Marie." And I took it home and I read it in 2 days, barely stopping, and I wept at the part you always weep at, and then I went back and asked for more, and she always had more. That library was a place of real weight, real importance. The hush inside it was not just a rule, it was a kind of respect for the fact that inside those walls was everything any human being had ever written down worth saving. And we felt that, even as children, we felt that. But reading wasn't only solitary, and I think that's what people forget. Families read aloud together, after supper, when there was no radio program on and the light outside was still good. A parent might read to the children. Not picture books. I mean real reading. Chapters, serials. The newspaper read aloud while everyone else sewed or whittled or just sat and listened. My father read us the Sunday funnies every week, doing all the voices. He did a Popeye that made us collapse. And that, the four of us around the kitchen table, my father doing Popeye while my mother tried not to laugh. That is a memory I have kept for more than 70 years now, and it has not faded one bit. Now, I said I wanted to come back to something, and I do, because we've talked about the porch and the music and the stories and the books, and all of it is true and all of it is real. But there is something underneath all of it that I haven't named yet, something that made all of it possible. It was slowness. Life moved slowly, not because people were lazy. Lord knows they weren't. Most of them worked harder in a day than we can imagine, but the pace of a life was different. An evening was long. A Sunday afternoon was endless in the best way. There was time to do a thing properly, to do a thing all the way through, to sit with a thing until it was done. And because life moved slowly, you noticed things. You noticed the way the light came through the kitchen window in late afternoon and made a stripe across the floor. You noticed the particular way your neighbor walked up the road. You could tell who it was from 100 yards off just by the walk. You noticed the smell of rain coming before it came, and the sound of the first crickets in August, and the exact moment in October when the air changed. You were present, not because someone told you to be mindful. Nobody used that word, but because there was nothing pulling you elsewhere. Your attention belonged to where you were, and that changed everything. Every game, every song, every story landed differently because you were actually there for it. Let me tell you about handwork, because it belongs here: sewing, quilting, embroidery, knitting, crocheting, whittling, wood carving, all of it. These were not crafts in the way we use the word today, something you do in a class or follow off a website. These were skills passed from hand to hand, grandmother to mother to daughter, grandfather to son. And they filled the evenings beautifully. I learned to quilt sitting beside my mother at the frame she set up in the back bedroom every fall. She was making a double wedding ring quilt that took her 3 winters to finish. 3 winters of evenings, sitting under that frame, piecing and stitching by lamplight, talking while her hands moved, and I sat beside her, and she taught me the stitches, one by one, and corrected me when I pulled too tight, and praised me when I got it right. And that quilt, when it was done, it went on my older sister's bed when she married, and my mother cried the day she gave it over because she knew every single stitch in it by feel. That is what handwork was. It was love made visible, made durable, made useful. It was time spent in a way that left something behind. And here's what I keep turning over in my mind. Those women, my mother, my grandmother, my aunts, they quilted and canned and cooked and sewed, and they were not martyrs about it. They were not resigned, they were proud. There was a dignity in the work of your hands that I think we have given up too casually, and I'm not sure we got something better in exchange. Now let me tell you about the radio, because I'd be leaving out something important if I didn't. The radio was the TV before TV, and it was beloved in a way that I'm not sure the TV ever quite matched. Because with the radio, you had to imagine. You'd sit in front of that big wooden cabinet, and they were beautiful pieces of furniture. Those old radios, not just appliances, you'd sit in front of it and the whole family would listen together, to programs, to serials, to comedies. Jack Benny, Fibber McGee and Molly, the Lone Ranger, the Shadow. And here's the thing about the radio that I want you to hold on to. When you listened to a radio program, you built the world inside your own head. The actor's voice gave you a character, and your imagination gave that character a face and a coat and a room to stand in. And that room was exactly the right room because you built it yourself. When television came along and showed you the room, it took that away from you, gave you someone else's version. And something small but real was lost in that exchange. I remember lying on the living room rug on a Sunday evening, my chin in my hands, listening to Jack Benny with my whole body. Laughing out loud at a voice coming out of a box, my parents in their chairs, my brother stretched out beside me. That rug had a smell wool and a little bit of dust, and I can smell it right now just thinking about it. Memory is funny that way. The nose holds on to things the eyes let go of, but the radio was not just programs. The radio was music all evening long if you wanted it. Big band music and swing. And the slow ballads that my mother would sometimes stop what she was doing to listen to, just stop completely and close her eyes for 30 seconds. Glenn Miller, Benny Goodman, Vera Lynn. songs that carried weight, songs that people needed during the war years especially, songs that said what was hard to say out loud, and people danced to those songs in their own kitchens. That happened. I have seen it. My father would come home from the evening shift, and my mother would still be up, and he'd tune the radio to something slow, and he'd take her hand right there by the kitchen table, and they'd dance in the little space between the refrigerator and the door. A minute, maybe two. And then supper would come out of the warm oven, and they'd sit down and eat and never mention it, but I saw it, and it has never left me. Now, and I want to be careful how I say this, because I don't want to paint everything rosy when the full picture was harder than that. The years I'm talking about, the 30s, the 40s, they were not easy years. The Depression had taken things from people that they never got back. Men who had owned their own businesses were selling apples on corners. Women were stretching a soup bone across 3 days of meals. Children were wearing shoes that didn't fit because there was no money for new ones and you didn't ask. And in the middle of all of that hardship, in the very middle of it, people still found ways to play. People still sang. Neighbors still sat on porches. Children still ran till dark. Because that was not frivolity and they knew it. That was the thing that kept you going. The pleasure of an evening with people you loved was not a luxury. It was medicine. It was the thing that reminded you what you were working toward. I think about a woman named Mrs. Fenwick, who lived 2 doors down from us when I was small. Her husband had lost his hardware store in 31 and never quite recovered, and they were very poor, quietly and proudly poor in the way people were then. And every 4th of July, without fail, Mrs. Fenwick made a strawberry ice cream. She had a hand-crank freezer, and she'd start cranking it at 10 in the morning. And by the afternoon, there'd be a bowl of the most beautiful pink ice cream you ever saw. And she'd call the neighborhood children over, and we'd each get a spoon of it, just a spoon, and it tasted like something out of a dream. She didn't have much, but she made something every single year, and every single year the children came running. That is the thing I'm trying to say. Fun, real fun before television, it was made. Assembled, constructed out of what was at hand by people who understood that the point was not the thing itself but the gathering around it. The ice cream was not the point. The children with their spoons in the July heat was the point. Let me talk about visiting because it was its own art form and we have nearly lost it entirely. People called on each other. That was the phrase. You called on someone. You walked to their house, or you drove if you had a car, and you knocked on the door and you were let in, and you sat in the parlor or the kitchen and you talked. No appointment, no plan, no agenda, you just went, and you were welcome because everyone understood that to be called upon was a good thing, a compliment, a sign that someone had thought of you and made the effort. My grandmother kept a tin of butter cookies on the second shelf of the china cabinet, specifically for callers. When someone came to the door, out came the tin, always, and the coffee pot went on, and whoever had come would sit for an hour or two and drink the coffee and eat the cookies and talk about whatever wanted to be talked about. Health, weather, children, the price of things, what was growing in the garden, what had happened at the church last Sunday, the whole range of a life, covered in small pieces over the course of an afternoon. And you went home feeling fuller than when you arrived, even though you'd done nothing but sit and talk, because that is what connection does. It fills you up in a way that nothing passive ever can. Saturday afternoons in summer were made for this. The visiting circuit, I used to think of it. My mother would get dressed after the morning's work was done, not fancy, but tidy, hair combed, clean apron if she was going to a house she knew well, and she'd make her rounds. Mrs. Patterson first, because she was elderly and didn't get out. Then the Halverson sisters, who always had some news and strong opinions about it. Then sometimes my mother's friend Ruth, who lived a mile out and had a farm, and always sent my mother home with something, eggs or a squash or a handful of dried beans. Those afternoons were not wasted time. They were the glue. The whole community held together because of those afternoons, those small regular acts of showing up and sitting down and paying attention to each other's lives. We have convenience now, and we have efficiency, and we have 100 ways to contact anyone at any moment, and we are lonelier than those women ever were, I believe that. Now I want to turn toward the games people played indoors because winter came and the porch went cold and you still had to fill the evenings. And here's where I have some of my warmest memories. Cards, oh, the cards, rummy and canasta, and pinochle and euchre. If you were in the Midwest, which we were, you learned to play cards almost before you learned to read in some families, mine included. My father taught me rummy when I was 5 years old, sitting at the kitchen table on a January evening with the snow coming down outside and the wood stove going full. And he dealt my cards as seriously as if we were playing for money, which of course we were not. And he let me win that first game. I know he did now, but he did it in such a way that I couldn't tell at the time, and I went to bed that night absolutely sure I was a card genius. Card nights were the winter version of the porch. People came over, 4, 6, 8 people around a table, with coffee or cocoa if there was cocoa, and sometimes a bowl of popcorn, and the cards and the talk going together for 3 hours easy, and the talk during cards was different from any other kind of talk, sharper, funnier, more honest somehow, because everyone's hands and eyes were occupied, and the guard came down a little. You said things at a card table you might not say anywhere else, checkers, chess in some households, dominoes, jigsaw puzzles spread across a card table in the corner, worked on slowly over several weeks, everybody adding a piece when they walked past. My grandfather had a puzzle of the Rocky Mountains, 1,500 pieces, and it sat on a folding table in his front room from November to March, and anybody who came by was expected to put in at least 3 pieces before they sat down. He'd stand there watching you, making sure you did it. Word games at the table that needed nothing at all, not even a pencil and paper, just a good mind and a willingness to play. 20 questions, I spy. My grandmother had a game she called Grandmother's Trunk, where each person had to recite a list and add 1 item each time, starting from the beginning every round, and if you missed an item, you were out. I never once beat my grandmother at her own game. She had a memory like a filing cabinet, and she would look just slightly pleased with herself every time someone else lost. The winter evenings had a particular quality. Darkness came early and settled in heavy, and the warm rooms inside felt warmer by contrast. There was something good about being shut in by weather with people you loved, something that built closeness in a way that the busy, warmer months didn't always allow. December and January were months of nearness. Everybody in one room, everybody around one light, the kind of closeness where you knew what everyone else was going to say before they said it, and loved them anyway, or maybe because of it. And Christmas, oh, I know we'll have more time to talk about Christmas another day, but I cannot get through a conversation about fun before television without at least touching on Christmas, because Christmas then was something it is very hard to describe to someone who didn't live it. The gifts were small. They had to be. An orange in the bottom of a stocking was a real gift, a real luxury, something you ate slowly because it was special. A doll that your mother had made herself, sewing it by lamplight after the children were in bed. A pocket knife, a book, a pair of mittens knitted in secret. These were the gifts, and the children opened them with a reverence that I don't think has anything to do with the children of those days being better children. It has to do with what scarcity does to gratitude. When you don't expect much, what you receive lands with its full weight. But the real gift of Christmas then was not under the tree. It was the people, the house full of people, cousins sleeping 4 to a bed, the aunts in the kitchen from dawn, the uncles out back in the cold talking about things men talked about, the noise and the warmth and the smell of everything cooking at once. That was the gift, that was the whole point. And we knew it. We knew it even then, even as children. Now, I want to circle back to something I said near the start, because I think it's the most important thing, and I want to make sure I've said it right. I said that boredom is not the absence of things to do, that boredom is the absence of people to be with. And I still believe that, but I want to add something to it. I think what we had before television was not just people. We had practice. We had years and years of practice at the art of being together without a distraction to fall back on. We had practiced stillness. We had practiced conversation. We had practiced the long, slow business of paying attention to another person, their face, their stories, what they said and what they couldn't bring themselves to say. We were good at it, not perfect. Lord knows there were difficult families and lonely people even then. That is the human condition, and no era escapes it. But as a general practice, as a thing we all did, we were good at sitting with each other, and that skill was passed down the way the quilt stitches were passed down, by doing it alongside someone, by watching and imitating and being corrected and trying again. And then the TV came. And I don't say that with bitterness. I have had my own TV for 60 years and I'm not against it. But it changed something. It gave us a reason to stop practicing. It gave us something to look at together that meant we no longer had to generate the conversation ourselves. And slowly, over a generation or two, we forgot how, or not forgot exactly, we got out of the habit. We got soft in that particular muscle the way you get soft in any muscle you stop using. And now there is so much to look at that we almost never have to look at each other. And I think we feel that. I think we feel the loss of it even if we can't always name it. But here's what I know. The capacity is still there. The need is still there. I see it in how people respond when someone takes the time to call them on the telephone, a real call, not a text, and talks for an hour. I see it in the way people at a dinner party lean in when someone tells a really good story. I see it in the way a grandchild sits still when a grandparent starts to talk about the old days, not because they were told to, but because something in them recognizes that this is real. This is the thing. This is what they've been hungry for. You carry all of it. You who sat on those porches, you who cranked the ice cream freezer, you who put your 3 puzzle pieces in before you sat down. You who sang around the piano on Sunday evenings and danced in the kitchen when no one was watching, you carry that. It is in you, all of it, every bit, and it is not a small thing that you carry. It is the memory of what it felt like to be fully present in a life, to be there, really there with the people who mattered most, in the rooms that smelled like home, in the evenings that stretched out long and slow and didn't ask anything of you but that you show up and stay. And maybe the best thing we can do with that memory is not just hold it, but offer it. Tell the young ones what it was like. Show them if you can. Turn off the screen for an evening and pull out the cards, or sit on the porch, or just start talking and keep talking until something real comes out, because they need it. They need it more than they know. And you know how to give it to them because someone once gave it to you. Thank you for sitting with me today. I love your company. I'll see you next time.